Okay, so you know how sometimes like you see a headline and it just kind of grabs you?
Mm-hmm.
That's what happened to me with this whole Elon Musk thing.
Oh, yeah.
Like a supposed secret U.S. war plan against China
Right.
and this idea of like a fatal trap for the Trump administration.
Yeah, it's a lot to unpack.
It is, it is. So let's just dive right into it. What do you think is the most interesting part of all this?
Mm. Well, for me, it's how this one media report
Right.
really sparked all this discussion, you
Yeah,
know? It
yeah.
makes you think about, like, what's really going on between the U.S. and China.
Exactly. And of course, Trump had to address it.
Of course.
On March 21st, he came out and said pretty clearly, the United States does not want any potential war with China.
Right.
But then he also said that if something did happen, the U.S. would be, fully capable of responding,
Yeah, classic Trump.
right? He basically just dismissed the whole report as dishonest.
Mm-hmm.
Like the media just made it up for clicks.
Sure.
He even mentioned talking to Defense Secretary Pete,
Okay.
who apparently denied it completely.
Huh.
And then he kind of joked that Musk was probably just at the Pentagon for the efficiency department.
The efficiency department.
Yeah, and that Musk would, run away if anyone even mentioned China.
Well, it sounds like he's trying to downplay it.
Oh, totally.
Yeah.
But it's still interesting to think about why this rumor even got started in the first place.
Right. It's like there's this underlying worry about conflict, you know?
Yeah. Especially when you look at everything else that's happening.
Like what?
Well, think about it. We have Paulson's trip to China,
Uh-huh.
which didn't really achieve what people were hoping for.
Yeah.
Then there's this temporary ceasefire between the U.S. and Russia.
Right. Which seems kind of unusual.
It does. And then there are all these rumors about U.S.-Europe relations being strained.
Because of concessions to Russia.
Exactly.
Hmm.
On top of all that, you have the U.S. financial situation,
Okay.
and some sources are linking that directly to this China factor.
Interesting.
They keep mentioning DeepSeek plus Huawei.
Ah, so they're talking about China's tech advancements.
Yeah, DeepSeek is that Chinese AI company, right?
Right. And Huawei, of course, is the telecom giant.
Yeah, it seems like their progress is really being seen as a threat.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely impacting the global economy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It all just adds up to this feeling that the administration's under a lot of pressure.
I can see that.
And the source material we're looking at today really emphasizes this contrast between the U.S. situation and China's strength.
Mm-hmm.
They talk about how much influence China has on the U.S. in all these different areas.
Okay.
By the end of 2024, they're saying it'll be huge.
Wow.
They even bring up Japan and the Plaza Accord.
Oh, interesting.
So for those who don't know, the Plaza Accord was this agreement back in the 80s
Mm-hmm.
that basically led to the Japanese yen becoming much stronger.
Right.
And some people argue that really hurt Japan's economy.
Yeah, I can see that.
The source is basically saying that Japan was vulnerable back then, partly because of weaknesses in its traditional security.
Okay, I see.
And now they're saying that China is much less vulnerable to that kind of pressure.
Because of the PLA's strength.
Exactly. They have a strong military presence in the region.
Makes sense.
And then in terms of non-traditional security, they talk about the Yarlung-Zangbo River hydropower project.
Oh, wow. That's a massive project.
It is. And they're using it as an example of China's ability to achieve what they call minimum economic internal circulation.
Okay, what does that mean exactly?
Well, it basically means that China can rely on itself for its basic economic needs.
Even if there are problems with global trade.
Exactly. They have these huge infrastructure projects that give them a lot of independence.
That's a pretty powerful position to be in.
It is.
Yeah.
So to really understand what's happening now, we have to go back and look at how Trump approached China before.
Okay.
The source describes him as the most tough U.S. president ever against China.
That's saying something.
Right. And it seems like the Biden administration basically continued that approach.
Mm-hmm.
But when Trump came back into office, he really ramped things up. Well, he took all these actions that challenged the one China principle.
Oh, wow.
He used Taiwan as a bargaining chip.
Interesting.
He tried to build this global tariff anti-China alliance.
Okay.
And he even suggested that the U.S. could control important maritime trade routes.
Which are essential for China.
Exactly. It was a very aggressive strategy.
I bet that made China nervous.
I'm sure it did.
Yeah.
And the source mentions this combination punch from China.
In response.
Yeah, they hit back in both traditional and non-traditional security areas.
So they weren't just going to sit back and take it.
Nope. And that's why the source says the Trump administration was basically starting with a blank sheet.
In terms of diplomacy and domestic affairs.
Exactly. They had to figure out a new approach.
So that's where Russia comes in.
It seems that way.
Right.
The source suggests that the Trump administration felt like they had to prioritize Russia first.
To maybe improve relations with China later on?
Yeah, it's like they thought maybe if they made some progress with Russia, it would somehow help with China.
That's an interesting theory.
And that leads us to this temporary, non-comprehensive ceasefire agreement with Russia.
Which sounds pretty unusual.
It does. But the source argues that for the Trump administration, any agreement was better than nothing.
Okay, so they needed a win.
Exactly. They needed to stabilize things so they could focus on China.
So this ceasefire was more about tactics than anything else.
That's what the source is suggesting.
Yeah.
So with all that in mind, the source lays out what it sees as the current situation.
For the Trump administration.
Yep. And it's pretty revealing.
Okay.
First, they say that the administration knows it needs to manage its relationships with China, Europe, and Russia carefully.
Right.
To deal with all the problems they have at home.
It sounds like they're feeling the pressure.
They are. And second, the relationship with China is absolutely key.
To the whole thing.
Yeah, it's like the most important piece of the puzzle.
That makes sense.
And third, getting the Sino-U.S. relationship right is now their top priority.
I see.
But here's where it gets interesting.
Go on.
The fourth point is that China is being very firm.
About what?
About Taiwan. They're refusing to even talk about a Taiwan deal.
Wow, so they're drawing a hard line.
They are. They're basically saying that any discussions have to focus on the South China Sea.
And this idea of the Pacific is big enough for both China and the U.S.?
Exactly. They're not giving Trump any easy wins.
So he can't just go over there and get a photo op.
Nope. They're making him work for it.
Which puts him in a tough spot.
It does. And so the fifth point is that the Trump administration is now willing to discuss the South China Sea.
Even though they were trying to avoid that before.
Yeah, and there are even allegations that they colluded with the EU in the arrest of former Philippine President Duterte.
That's pretty significant.
It is. It suggests that they're willing to make some pretty big moves to try and get China to the table.
And what about Russia? Where do they fit into all of this?
Well, the sixth point is all about Russia.
Okay.
They're basically seeing this whole situation as a chance to get what they want from the U.S.
Like what?
Like a return to Syria and the lifting of sanctions.
Things that are really important to them.
Yeah, and the source argues that the more desperate the Trump administration gets, the more Russia will push for these things.
So they're exploiting the situation.
Basically. And then the seventh point brings in Europe.
Okay.
The source says that all the compromises the Trump administration is making with Russia, combined with how badly they want a China visit, are making things really difficult between the U.S. and the EU.
So their relationship is getting strained.
Yeah, it's getting really delicate.
Yeah.
Which brings us to this whole idea that Trump's strategy has backfired.
How so?
Well, he was trying to isolate China, right?
With this vertical and horizontal alliance thing.
Right. Make friends far away and attack those nearby.
Yeah.
But now it seems like the EU is becoming a bigger problem than China.
Oh, wow. So it's kind of blown up in his face.
That's what the source is suggesting.
Yeah.
And they point to this news report about Jason Greenblatt.
Who's that?
He's one of Trump's advisors.
Okay.
And he apparently suggested that Saudi Arabia could be a good place for a U.S.-Russia summit.
And what did Russia say?
Well, Dmitry Peskov was pretty cautious in his response.
Interesting.
But the implication is that this summit wouldn't just be about Ukraine.
It would involve the Middle East, too.
Exactly. And then you have Dmitry Medvedev making all these mocking comments.
Oh, yeah, he loves to do that.
He does. And then you have Netanyahu's actions in Gaza and the West Bank.
Right.
Which the source says are making the EU feel really vulnerable.
So everyone's feeling the pressure.
Everyone.
Yeah.
And this is where things take another turn.
What do you mean?
Well, there's this report about Wang Yi meeting with one of Macron's top advisors.
Uh-huh.
And then Macron himself announced that he's going to Egypt to talk about rebuilding Gaza.
Okay.
The source interprets this as EU leaders realizing they need to find other partners.
Other than the U.S.
Right. They need help, and they're looking to China.
So just like the Trump administration prioritized Russia, the EU is now prioritizing China.
That's what it looks like. And the source uses this image of two mahjong tables.
Two mahjong tables.
Yeah, one for Ukraine and one for the Middle East.
So two separate spheres of influence.
Exactly. And it's kind of ironic because Trump's strategy was supposed to isolate China.
But now it's potentially isolating the U.S.
Yeah, his closest ally is becoming more of a problem than his biggest rival.
That's not a good look.
Not at all. But the source says that this all goes back to Trump's main concern.
Which is?
His internal political struggles.
Right.
They argue that he sees fixing the relationship with China as the key to solving his problems at home.
because a good relationship with China would help the U.S. economy.
Exactly. And that would make him look good.
So it's all connected.
It is.
Yeah.
Now, even if the EU isn't openly challenging the U.S. on Ukraine, the source says they might be causing trouble in other areas.
Like the Middle East.
Exactly. They argue that all the internal fighting in the U.S. has forced the Trump administration to be passive on Middle East policy.
Meaning?
Meaning they're basically stuck supporting Netanyahu.
Okay.
And that's causing tension with Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and the EU.
Who all have their own interests in the region.
Right. And the source says that this is leading to more and more public disagreements between the U.S. and the EU.
So their alliance is really being tested.
It is. And then there's the report about the IDF arresting Palestinians in Bethlehem.
Okay.
The source frames this as Netanyahu taking advantage of the situation.
To strengthen his own position.
Yeah. And they even imagine what Netanyahu might be thinking.
Like what?
Well, they suggest that he feels justified in prioritizing Israel's interests.
Because of how Trump treated him in the past.
Exactly. It's like he's getting payback.
That's a pretty cynical view.
It is, but it's interesting to think about. And all of this leads to a really big question.
What's that?
What happens if the Houthi armed forces in Yemen manage to establish a government?
That would be a major development.
It would. And the source wonders if that could lead to some kind of alliance between China, Russia, and the EU.
Against the U.S.
Potentially. They also mentioned Trump's letter to Khamenei in early March.
The one about the nuclear deal.
Yeah, it was a very strongly worded letter with a 2-month deadline.
Right, and he warned Iran about the consequences of advancing their nuclear program.
Exactly. And the White House apparently briefed allies on this letter.
Okay.
But Iran's response has been kind of muted.
What do you mean?
Well, their foreign minister called it more of a threat.
Okay.
And Khamenei himself said that threats don't work. The source finds this delay and lack of a strong response strange.
Especially since the U.S. made the letter public.
Right. It makes you wonder what they're up to.
I see what you mean.
There are also reports of a second letter that was sent to President Raisi.
Okay.
But only the one to Khamenei was made public.
That's interesting.
The source wonders if this was a deliberate attempt to expose divisions within Iran's leadership.
By playing them against each other.
Yeah, that's a possibility.
Yeah.
And this connects back to the Peace Bond 2025 military exercises.
Oh, China, Russia, and Iran.
Right. The source asks if China and Russia might now be suspicious of Iran.
Like they think Iran might be giving in to U.S. pressure?
Exactly. And they describe Iran as being in a very weak position.
Making them a potential scapegoat.
Exactly. If things go wrong, the Trump administration could blame it all on Iran.
To deflect attention from their own mistakes.
Exactly. So the source is basically saying that both Trump and the Iranian leadership are under a lot of pressure.
And they're both looking for a way out.
Yeah, it's a tough situation for everyone involved.
And how does Saudi Arabia fit into this?
Well, the source mentions that the Trump administration might be hesitant to accept a U.S. ally Iran.
Because of Saudi Arabia?
Exactly. Because Saudi Arabia is getting closer to China.
Right.
And they don't want to upset that relationship.
So it's a balancing act.
It is. And then going back to the Houthis in Yemen,
okay,
the source suggests that a lot of different groups might be watching them very closely.
Including the EU.
Possibly. They want to see how strong they really are.
And how Iran reacts to any U.S. attacks against them.
Right. They're also thinking about who might emerge as the leader of the Shiite Muslim community in the future.
So it's about more than just Yemen.
It is. It's about the whole region.
Yeah.
So the big question is, what happens if China, Russia, and the EU all decide that the Houthis can actually control Yemen?
And form a stable government.
Right. Would that mean the EU and the U.S. are really drifting apart?
And would Russia see that as a chance to get back into the Middle East?
Without the U.S.?
Yeah. Could we be seeing the start of a new alliance between China, Russia and the EU?
It's definitely something to think about.
Yeah.
And then finally, we had this news about Elon Musk and xAI.
His AI company.
Yeah, they're joining an investment fund led by BlackRock.
To compete with OpenAI.
Exactly. And this follows BlackRock's earlier announcements about working with xAI and NVIDIA.
So they're teaming up?
They are. The source suggests that this could be the beginning of a whole new alliance.
Between Musk and BlackRock.
Yep. And this connects back to Musk's Starlink system.
Which is being used in Ukraine.
Right. And SpaceX's recent space rescue mission.
Okay.
The source sees all of this as part of this growing new military-industrial complex. And they say that the fact that Trump and his allies are embracing this complex
shows that they're getting impatient.
Yeah, and that they're ready to take action.
To get what they want.
Exactly. And the source has a really interesting take on BlackRock.
Okay.
They point out that BlackRock has ties to the old American military-industrial complex.
Right.
But that they also have a good relationship with Musk.
So they're playing both sides.
In a way, the source describes them as American capital interests representing Western capital interests publicly detached from the European and American platforms since the Egyptian turmoil.
Wow, that's a mouthful.
It is. But basically, they're saying that BlackRock is independent.
From both the old and new military-industrial complexes?
Yeah, they're kind of their own thing.
A powerful force to be reckoned with.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they compare this to Paulson's recent trip to China.
The former Treasury Secretary.
Yeah, they call him a narrator on Wall Street.
I like that.
And a three-sided figure, meaning he can work with the U.S., Europe, or even China.
So he's very well connected.
He is. And the source suggests that this kind of global perspective could be really useful.
In navigating the current geopolitical landscape.
Exactly. And finally, they point out that China is incredibly important to both BlackRock and Musk.
Because of the potential for profit.
Exactly. They're both looking for ways to make money.
And China offers a lot of opportunities.
It does. So it's all about following the money.
As always.
So we've covered a lot of ground today.
We have.
From Elon Musk to China, Russia, the EU, and the Middle East.
And the role of technology and finance.
It's a complex and constantly changing world out there.
It certainly is.
And it makes you wonder what the future holds.
Yeah. What alliances will we see?
What conflicts might emerge?
And what role will technology play in all of it?
So much to think about.
Definitely food for thought.
Well, that's it for our deep dive today.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us.
It was fun.
Always is. Until next time.
See ya.
Bye.